And yesterday, it's interesting, Malcolm Smith and I and Dave had a walk through Westmead. I think Malcolm probably hadn't been here for a little while. We started up at the station at the Western Sydney University, the old sort of boys' home up there, and the innovation quarter that Mark's developing. We started up there and we walked down Hawkesbury Road, and I said it was a bit like Las Vegas because there are these big institutions, these big, bright, shiny buildings that are full of dreams about how they're going to improve our lives. And then you sort of walk to the next one, and then you walk to the next one. And there's so many of them lined up in a row. And then eventually we walked down through Cumberland Hospital and we entered a different world, which was the world of 18th century mental health care, which was beautiful. Bit of scar tissue with the light rail going through, but that'll come back. And we eventually ended up down in that heritage precinct where there's 80 listed buildings and listed trees, and finally plonked ourselves out at Fleet Street at the Hope Hostel. That took about an hour. We did stop a couple of times, so it's a really big precinct. But look, to give us a help and to set some context and give us an international view, we asked Malcolm if he could come. I'm just going to read a little bit of your bio, Malcolm. I normally don't. Malcolm's an architect, an award-winning architect, and a founding director of the Integrated City Planning team at Arup, London. He's out here at the moment. His work is formed around the philosophy of integrated thinking and the recognition that complex urban projects have specific entry point issues that lead the direction of change. Some of the projects that he's been involved with include North Stowe Newtown Masterplan, Cambridgeshire, Central to Everleigh, so I'll get this back up here, the Wellcome Genome campus in Cambridgeshire, Preston Beach Newtown, Western Australia, and the Tottenham post-right strategy. So I'm dying to hear about that. Please welcome Malcolm Smith.
David, thank you. And hopefully in the first few words, I have been spending a bit of time in London, but I'm a COVID returner. So after 24 years in London, we decided to come back at the beginning of the year. I'm humbled in one way by hearing what I've heard, both last night and this morning, hearing Jeff and the panel talk about the level of detail that we see in Westmead. And so I hope an outcome of what I'm going to share with you, and I am going to use slides because then I can hide behind the slides, is kind of just a reflection. It's a kind of a cloud to push against from some of my experience of, jumping around the world looking at different things and the way in which some of these contexts are coming forward. Many of the things that you are doing are the leading edge, and you should, acknowledge that and recognise that. Hopefully this reflection is the beginning of a story. If I just do that, inside out and outside in. I think about 15 years ago, I was asked by the World Health Organization to go over to Geneva, and we sat down, and the notion of what was a healthy city was starting to come forward. I think we started to see some of the discussions on density and urbanisation, but when we tried to define what it was, it didn't really exist. So we crafted this. A healthy city is one that continually creates and improves its physical, social environments, and I think the social environment's absolutely critical, and expands the community, the wider context, that enables people to support each other, developing to their potential. And so just remind yourself that that was kind of a 10 to 15 year ago view of what we tried to articulate as a healthy city. But the context that I want to then kind of jump straight to is what David referred to is one of the contemporary projects that we were working on just before I came back. And that was the Wellcome Genome campus. And I heard, we've heard discussions about the role of private capital and the like. This is what an organisation, the Wellcome Trust, that has a £24 billion endowment, whose objective is the betterment of humankind. Founded by Henry Wellcome on the pharmaceutical company, but their objective is doing that. It was in Hingston that they took the decision to start mapping the human genome. Why did they do that? because a consortium had formed in the United States that was going to map it at the same time in the early 90s, and they were going to privatise it. They were going to patent your human genome. And Wellcome said, that's not right. It is humankind's. So they threw about between 3 and 5 billion. They won't tell me exactly how much went it. And each Friday, they published a piece of the human genome for the betterment of humankind. That has now grown into one of the, eminent genomics research institutes in the world. And they're expanding it. And so we started a story that the Sanger Institute started relatively small with 50 people in Cambridgeshire to push something out every Friday with a little piece of the human genome. The Sanger Institute began to grow. The genomics is effectively based on biodata, one of the largest data users in the world. And we've spoken about, what is the infrastructure of health in the future that requires data will be one of those things. But it becomes an asset. So the European Biodata Institute marries next to the Sanger, pure discovery science. To give you a feeling, the institutes get £100 million a year to simply do discovery science. But Wellcome is an endowment. And so they start to see the way in which the biodata is expanded out. They start to see the critical offer of quality of place for those very smart people who are working in the genomics. A conference centre forms. A nursery is placed in there very early. The wetlands condition is made at the same time. They're building the institute, they're building the biodata, and they start in the green circles of the startup conditions, the translation that starts to sit geographically next to each other. And so they're building an ecosystem. What they're trying to do is to expand the translation from the discovery science all the way up into the pink areas of the commercialisation. This is not virtual relationships. This is physical bump space. And I'll talk a little bit about bump in a while. That is the ecosystem of 6,000 scientists and that has been built by the Wellcome Trust when they do it. Now, what underlies that is an economic engine. So the Wellcome Trust support the translation and the startup by supporting those companies, and as they grow and prosper, they get a return that they feed back into the endowment. So there's a very interesting kind of localised economic cycle that exists in Wellcome. And it is something that I think is an asset, particularly thinking about hearing what the characteristics of Westmead exist, that could be considered further. And we were talking with some people last night about examples that might be elsewhere in Australia. But this economic cycle that kind of circulates value, not value capture, but value circulation inside the precincts. So we started to do that, and then we realised this was an arms race of people. These people could choose to be anywhere in the world. And so we started to kind of say, so how do we battle this? It starts with very basic stuff. I think we heard in the previous panel talking about what I would like in my workplace. I can tell you that's one thing. What was more important was what is the quality of life for my family that I could exist and bring to. And Wellcome have begun to build it. This is stories of nursery, of dry cleaners. This is stories of where is the school, what is the local health facility. This is adding a level of infrastructure, of social infrastructure to the precinct that is the engine of attraction. And so Wellcome are going to build this. They're going to build this, and because of the offer into the kind of a core genomics precinct, they get the benefit to the surrounding community. And so it begins to open it up and break down these barriers that often come with these highly technical precinct developments. So we said on one side was the genomics ecosystem, on the other side was the lifestyle offer. And so marrying those two together, we get a genomics ecosystem and the complementary community. And I think that's one thing that I would want to leave with you. What is the complementary community that supports Westmead? what exists, what are the gaps, and how do we begin to kind of fill that in and understand what those needs are? Because I think it's very clear when you are in that arms race of, it was interesting to hear the Asia-Pacific discussions talking about contextualising it. People have choice. And it's more than just technical provision of their workplace. So we developed a nice spatial idea. This is beautiful Cambridgeshire, so, let's not think it's the same here. But the delightful walking over the river yesterday afternoon with David. The landscape that is just towards the edge of Westmead is something that kind of feels in one way very remote to the heart of the main road. So we talked about, this was a place that was locked down inside. We turned it inside out. This was inviting the community to the heart of the genomics campus by the creation of a new place of gathering, effectively a new common, a square, a place where they gather. We talked about the bump space, all the clever genomic scientists and startups working together. But do you know what we forgot? We forgot that it was equally important to have wandering space. What do I mean by wandering? Wandering is the space where creative thinking, often in our subconscious, I tell the story that one of the deputy chairperson of Arup, who's a pretty clever designer, he talks about his wandering space being in a bath with a scuba diving sketch pad. Now, there's an image for those who work with him that we possibly don't need to replicate, but it is the subconscious wandering. And I think there is a correlation between the intensity that the people working inside the likes of Westmead, almost wandering, and respite that needs to sit cheek and jowl to the kind of the provision of the facilities. So don't forget wandering. This is what it looks like. It's kind of, slightly Arcadian Cambridgeshire. There was a very important relationship of looking outwards. And I know this feels minuscule in the discussion of a precinct, but the sense of these kind of spatial work relationships and some of the direct correlations between the way in which people heal and the consequence are some of the assets that I think are lying latent, as we are in Westmead, and the relationships and the place of gathering and wandering. And so there was welcome. Beginning to develop a whole series of outcomes that I'll expand on a little bit further. So in one way, we have genomics and the ecosystem, and we have a complementary community. And I thought for today it'd be interesting to kind of explain the way in which I guess we began to see that. One is looking inside out, so that's genomics working outwards. It could be healthcare working outwards. The other is the way you look outward in. What is that outward in context? Well, the inside-out stuff, we began to think about, there it is kind of, arrows on the page of Westmead. But I don't think we really understood where the future of healthcare was going. So we were very fortunate. We have a foresight team in Arup. We embarked on about 18 months ago, 12 months ago, a thing that said, answer the question, what is the future of healthcare? And so they started to talk about, what are the disruptors? Well, we know that. I've felt that. I felt that deeper, and we were talking the other day. There will be a social and cultural tail to the pandemic. And to hear the discussion, and we're talking about Sydney and its context, the preciousness that will differentiate. Do not underestimate. But it will solve itself, and there are others coming. The response and the responsibility of precincts in the environments we make and the way in which we address climate change. We have social issues of ageing and supporting our ageing populations. We have a changing workforce of the way in which they work, the tools that they use, and the way in which they deploy them. We have new technologies. This was amazing. And I'm not a big statistics believer, and architects are. We kind of talk in narrative. 88% of US healthcare providers investing in remote patient monitoring. Now, this is a kind of substantial change. This is a systemic change in the way in which healthcare provision is being made, and it has spatial implications. What did it really, how will these systems change? We will get increasingly into preventative models, the environments that we make, what Catherine was saying, from childhood to adulthood. We see some examples of the way in which we move, the land use distribution that makes it convenient to move around, the quality of mixed age environments. We will have a much more kind of human-centred focus. That image of welcome looking out into a landscape is critical. And I think that relationship, because it is not the inner urban of a city, this is the beauty of a landscape context, I think was one of the things that I took away from walking around with David yesterday, that it is just there. It's just there. And it's so close for a beautiful characteristic. There are some very nice examples of, in Norway, as you would expect the Norwegians to do, beautiful kind of, soft environments, and we're moving. Diffusing the monolith. Now, this is the kind of projection out. And we heard Catherine talk about the new facilities that are coming. What's really changing is the diagram of, I want to jump to this one, where historically we have effectively dark is acute, white is non-acute. And we have these kind of, big systems that do this. We think we're moving into a dispersed model. And so what is the precinct in 15 years' time when the provision of healthcare is a dispersed model? So there will be a porosity of the physical edge of the precinct that I think we have to think about. And I think that has an important relationship with the landscape that it's in and the technology that it's deployed, because it's a physical and a virtual porosity that will come through in healthcare in the future. So let's jump to the other way. Let's go outside in. And I think there were two things that I thought I wanted to cover today. What makes a competitive precinct? And we've heard a little bit about that. We'll see how we align. And I want to talk about the halo of change. We, a little while ago, worked with some of the team, the global team in Jones Lang LaSalle, and did a thing called contemporary competitiveness. And we interviewed about 300 to 400 different companies that had choices of where they operated. And we began to conclude there were 4 or 5 key conditions that was competitive. Now, I ummed and ahed whether or not I would put this map up on, because you can see what's not there. And you can see what's there, and as a Queenslander of history, I kind of apologise for South East Queensland, not my call gov. I think if we did this today, it's clearly missing the role of health and well-being as a kind of generator. But look at those clusters and the way in which places being known, the way in which Jeff described the 3 cities having a characteristic that isn't about their geography, it's about their kind of DNA of use. And we're seeing technology, environment and economy. And I think we could almost cut through that today with the role of health. There were 5 things. Next generation cities. I could talk about all of those things, but the critical one is speed. There is kind of the speed with which, and if you drew the analogy of Asia Pacific and the relationship, it moves so much faster in terms of planning, certainty, delivery. Now, there's some trade-offs in that of some governance systems, and I respect that. But equally, there is a dichotomy there of how quickly you can move. And it's delightful to hear some of the discussions coming from New South Wales government level that allows that speed. But speed is a critical thing of clarity. They talked about technology, not in terms of kit, but in terms of speed of change. When I was walking with David down the road yesterday, and at the moment where there's some work being done, they've marked all the services on the road. Have a look. That's the problem. Those roads are thick with services, hard to change, and the speed with which technology in medicine and in workplace is changing needs a more agile infrastructure. Political and economic integration, almost governance, but an architect is not going to talk to you about governance. What I'm going to say is that, I think I learned quickly when we were working on the London Olympics, 5 boroughs, the most deprived areas of Europe, and how did they come together? Now, the advantage of an Olympic Games is you have an opening ceremony. The disadvantage of a health precinct is you don't have those kind of cliff moments. But they're coming, sometimes unpredicted. And the pandemic has shown us that. So we have to kind of generate those ways of motivating the clarity, of bringing consensus together. The one that I didn't put up here was Zouders in Amsterdam. And this is the southern district of Amsterdam. Amsterdam has a strategy on its major precincts of nominating a supervisor. I was that person. And taking responsibility for those strategies and overall things. They bring together planning power. They are autonomous in the decision of planning at large-scale precincts. There is a responsibility to the city, but you determine planning as you do at Stratford. And I think that speed issue and that planning issue and that kind of bringing together are critical structural issues of the operation of the precinct. The leisure and cultural offer, going back to the people and what the offer is. Forget all the words, the critical one there is authenticity. I can't remember who said, Jeff, you might have said, there's 200 of these around the world, at least. And people are sick and tired of anywheresville. And so by understanding the cultural history of place, the physical history of place, allows the genuine authenticity to become a determining factor in what is encouraging in a precinct. Urban well-being and livestock, many of the things that we've covered before. Let's be clear, those drawings were done for the extension of Beijing. And so, these agendas are resonating deep and quickly around the world. And so the way which we mix populations and the like. Look, the other thing I just wanted to talk about very quickly was the notion of a halo, the journey over time. I can't remember. David told me when the metro and the systems become live, there are many years to go. And I think it's critical to have the clarity of vision that we've heard. But when we were working in Amsterdam, we came up with an adage, a sense of completeness at any point in time. The future for the people who work in Westmead is not 10 years. It's tomorrow walking from the station. And we have a responsibility to create that sense of completeness. So this notion of the master plan and the vision is one way of doing it. We increasingly do staged, interim, temporary land use strategies, almost to greater levels of detail than the vision strategies. Because that's the evolution, the custodianship, the curation role of the precinct in a very different way. So look, I'm going to jump through this quickly. Imagine the little squirrels are the railway lines are arriving. We often kind of imagine all the development happening around it. But do you know where it really happens in that journey? It happens in the halo around it. Because the market says, I'm not getting involved in that complex precinct. I can buy a block of land. I know the railway line's coming. I'm developing there. What we're learning is that in that kind of collection of interest parties of precincts, you must engage the halo of change. And so I ask the question, what is the extent of the halo of Westmead? So what are the tactics? That's all kind of nice diagrams, slightly theoretical. I'm an architect, we make places. We said that to the genomic scientists and they said, yeah, not sure I believe you. What they did is they stretched us. They said, you have to start thinking of tactics of place from a microbial level. This is talking to an architect, so, for about the first 4 months, didn't get it. From microbial level up, and we took them up to planetary. Because we do have responsibilities of the resources we use. We do have responsibilities of the carbon that we're making. So what did? We built a little diagram that said, at microbial, it's fairly intangible. I can't see microbes. I can feel an open space, and I can't see planetary impact. But if we're going to operate across the kind of breadth of spectrum that a precinct offers, I encourage us to think of that kind of cone of reference from the intangible. What did we do? I'm going to run through some projects that were kind of interesting. At microbial level, just to give myself a little bit of kind of scientific rigor here, Scientific America in 2015 published an article that talked about our guttural diversity and the relationship to human happiness. So as you laugh why we're putting cows in landscapes, it's not that crazy. So we began to think about how do you integrate livestock, living environments into our landscapes instead of them being just manicured. We began to think about the notion of dirty play, of allowing this kind of softness of edge of the way in which we interface with our landscapes. We jumped up to the individual. We're doing projects at the moment where we are collecting particulates out of the air, the 2.5 micron parts that run through the wall of our lungs, says the architect, to a room full of medical specialists. But we can now have technology of washing the air. We have road systems that are quieter and porous. We have living units that are half-complete houses that allow people to get into entry points and grow their place of dwelling. We have new types of buildings that mix the uses vertically and horizontally, instead of procured the way in which we get budgets and the like coming forward at the moment, which in part produces that building of, Las Vegas, building after building after building. The monetary cycle that allows this to happen is manifest in the environments that we see. At the community level, we started to think about, and here we are, the temporary land use strategy, the most expensive development land in the Netherlands. 7 hectares, we planted out as cornfields one summer. We had a harvest festival. We cut a maze through it. They brought in some pigs for a harvest festival run by Accenture. Sorry, EY. The Accenture Gardening Club ran it. But what it did, it changed the identity of place immediately. Now, the challenge is of much of the land that is around Westmead. I think a temporary land use strategy could produce some incredibly interesting tactics of identity change. It does work on the value equations as well. So we've got some clever ways to think about it. Look, we're jumping up to societal levels. The little diagram in the middle is the centre of London. It's the Crown Estate, owned by what is ever left of the royal family. But it was the greening of the Crown Estate, the wild West End, the rewilding of our physical environments. So, an opportunity to operate at that scale. Park deck covering over the decks of infrastructure. When we're walking around the widths of the roads, a remnant of a different time. We've just finished a project in Stuttgart where we have taken the major road out of the centre of Stuttgart. We have landscaped it, and it is now effectively an ecological corridor. This is the home of Porsche and Mercedes-Benz. The world is moving. And then finally, that kind of intangible planetary systems. We are able to reveal those invisible conditions, how we use resources. What are the circular economies of cycles of waste that we begin to do? What is the responsibility of a precinct? It is substantial. And how do we kind of communicate that going forward? So we started some 15 years ago of what is a healthy city. I don't know whether we're right, I don't know whether we're wrong, but we're on the journey. Welcome taught us about that ecosystem and that kind of physical adjacency between translation, between discovery science, and I think Catherine was talking about some of those things, of the value of some of those things, and the way in which they translate, but the physical adjacency, that is one of the assets that I see in Westmead. But it is supported by a complementary community that sits next to it with a quality of life and to the broader family units that will fill the kind of the richness of support of skills that Westmead will run on. Remember, it's a kind of double dance to think about that notion of what is coming inside and the changing nature of healthcare and what is coming outside. And that maybe we are moving into the dispersed model of healthcare provision. And maybe that asks the question is, where is the boundary of Westmead? Where is its physical boundary? Where is its virtual boundary? And how do we kind of reconcile those things as we move towards the diagram in the top right? We talked about competitiveness, and in the heart of that was a story of speed. I think that is related to planning and certainty. The vision and the clarity is abundant in what was spoken about before, but the delivery at speed with providence is critical. Don't forget the donut, don't forget the halo. Where is that halo forming and how is that coming forward in time? There is a cone at which we can operate on, from our intangibles through to the tangible environments we do, and then the intangible at a planetary level. And the responsibility that comes with dealing with cities at scale means that we are held accountable to that cross-section of outcome. There are many delightful projects. We increasingly don't do master plans. We do integrated placemaking strategies because we sometimes forget that axis of time, that sense of completeness at any point in time of the lived experience. And so how do you finish that story? You finish it by that, because all of what I said becomes redundant because place is about a lived experience. And if you want to understand lived experience, get a child to draw a piece of city. And if you look at that drawing done by Finnabar now a good while ago while we're working in East London, he shows you the route to his grandma's house. He talks about, because of rubbish in the nursery, I don't like going there. This experience-led outcome. We did a little piece of work called Urban Childhoods, and we now work with Lego and the like, and children as a kind of indicator at the canary species of cities is becoming a resonant condition. I think there's something beautiful about the analogy and the kind of interrelationship of the caregiving to children. Catherine and I were talking about it at dinner last night. The way in which they see experience and they test outcome better than any KPIs. So inside out and outside in. I think that's the way healthcare is evolving, and I hope that's been an interesting sounding board for some amazing discussions on Westmead. David, thank you very much.
Thanks, Malcolm. I don't know if this is working. All right, maybe I'll take that and you grab the next one. Just a quick Q&A because we need to go to the break pretty soon, Malcolm. Amazing presentation. Question for you. You mentioned Zoidus in Amsterdam. You had a supervisor role in terms of placemaking.
Yeah.
What did that involve? What powers did you have in this role to create?
I had the powers of, because I was the, I don't think they knew I was Australian. I was the English person in Amsterdam who couldn't speak Dutch. So I went there one day a week. The responsibilities that we had were effectively setting the overall spatial strategies. That was they do a vision every 5 years of place, and that is a widely consulted, there was 45,000 people that were involved, as the Dutch would, in the evolution of the Visi document that we wrote. I wrote that version of the vision document. We had detailed documentation on the development proposals that were coming forward. The rubber hit the road when we were choosing designers of projects. And so we got to work with developers and, there was a museum being made. We worked with the state architect on who was designing different projects. So it was fairly wide, and it was more than just the buildings. These were the open space structures, the road structures, bridges, the kind of the physical built environment, and then the whole agenda of sustainable placemaking. That was my responsibility to set that agenda. And it feels, for a very kind of inclusive community like the Dutch, to appoint one person into that role, it doesn't mean I had kind of, ultimate play. It was very kind of, consultative in that process. But there was an absolute clarity. And I think as we tackle precincts of scale and change, that there is value in looking at those type of roles.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because if you ask now, who is responsible, who is that person in the Westmead precinct now, I couldn't think of who it is. I think everyone's got a little bit of a role to play. There's big projects coming, they're going to change place, but I don't think there's one person that wakes up in the morning and says, my job is to create a great place in Westmead, to work with everyone, to corral them, to use whatever resources I have. Just another quick question, because we're going to break in a sec, but there's big things that are going, big change makers. Some of them are not coming for a while yet. The metro's 10 years away. Place strategy delivered last December. I think has some great, there's new bridges. They're going to take a while. We've got to find the money for those. We've got to design them. We've got to build them. There are a few things happening in the next few years. Mark Stanty, Charter Hall, Western Sydney are delivering the Innovation Quarter. CSI Ray's coming. There'll be some placemaking there. Mark Hovey's from First Point. He's doing the hotel. That might happen in that timeframe. I think he sent through some benchmarks, so that's good. And of course, light rail will be probably the biggest near-term game changer because that's happening very soon. That's going to be operating possibly late next year. But when we walked through Westmead yesterday, there did seem to be a lack of walkability, a lack of retail, a lack of those things that the community wants. What could we do in that 3-year period to sort of start to improve the look and feel, the walkability?
David, I think it goes back to the whole kind of tactic of that sense of completeness at any point in time. We ran a program in Amsterdam called 15 by 15. So we started in 2012 and we said that we're going to do 15 very interesting projects. That ranged from the cornfields to art installations and the whole like. I think Westmead could do something like 25 by 25. In the next 3 years there is a clear program, all the strategic visions are well in place, and the implementation we've heard from Amy talk about. But I think that kind of, it's almost kind of possibly a subset of Jeff's 100-day program. I would have a clear program and a kind of an appointed steward of delivering this kind of temporary placemaking and these opportunities to begin to change the identity of place in a clever, acute, and hopefully valuable way, socially valuable. And I would argue it begins to kind of contribute to the wider economics as well. So maybe 25 by 25, I'll add to Jeff's 100-day program as an idea that we could maybe pursue.
I just think that's a fantastic idea for this conference to consider. We can't wait 10 years for the Metro before we start creating a wonderful Westmead, and having someone that's a fixed point of responsibility with some sort of a budget to corral everyone together is such a great idea. I know Troy Daly's here from the Commission. He's organising some workshops. I think it's a rare skill to have worked on creating great places around health and research centres internationally. So I really hope you can continue to be involved. Thank you very much, Malcolm Smith.
Thank you very much, and thank you.